Hi everyone, it's Chris Guillo from Merchant Method, and you are watching Merchant Method Trend Reports for independent retailers, makers, and small batch manufacturers. I am super excited you're here. These trend reports, if you are new to them or new to Merchant Method, combine what we're seeing in the retail industry with experience-based training. And really that combination of those two things is designed specifically so that independent retailers and makers can take more action now and can build more profit with ease. So that is why I'm here with you today. If you are new, you can join me every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Pacific, and we're going to be talking about the relevant trends that I want you to pay attention to because I believe that they will help develop your knowledge and help you feel more confident in the actions that you're taking for your business. So this report is about the truth about data analytics for retailers. Really, we're hearing a lot of things like big data and small data and analysis, and I want to help bridge the gap between what big retailers and what well-funded, well-capitalized startups what they're paying attention to, so that you can start to better understand what you need to pay attention to and what you don't need to pay attention to. You might already be gathering this information, and we just need to put a little bit of structure around it or put a name to it. So that's the point of this report. This report is part 4 of a 4-part series titled Use Your Size to Your Advantage. So whatever size your business is, whether you are 1 location or 15, whether it's your first year or your 15th, use your current size. And the trend reports have built over time to really help you understand exactly how you can do it. You've known why, but you may not have known how to do that. And so the first trend report was around business agility, really studying how online retailers and tech startups are shaping their behavior so that they can stay agile and stay on the pulse and get in front of their customers and get in front of the trend. What we studied was what is that skill set and how you can apply that to your independent business. The second in the series, Style, Selling, and Sales, is really modernizing your understanding of the fundamentals of retail, like really putting some current examples to the fundamentals. And then last week's trend report, part 3 in the series, Competitive Analysis for Independent Retailers and Makers, provided some framework, some examples of how to create a structured analysis, but really featured a mindset shifts and the considerations to have as you start to gather your research. Whether those considerations and that information gets put into a structured analysis or whether it's more organic, that trend report will help you put on the thinking cap and put on the investigator cap in your analysis. And this week's report really is about demystifying big data and small data for a small retailer. So we need to start off by talking about why retailers use data. And then we're going to talk about these popular types of data as we make our way to really embracing directional data. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So really, why do retailers use data? We use data for many reasons, but firstly, we want to measure how successful we are, how well we're doing, how well we're performing by studying and measuring key performance indicators, which you're well aware of. There are so many of them. A few of the more popular, more common ones are revenue variance over last year or revenue variance versus plan, right? Comparable store sales, same store sales, gross and net profit percent and profit dollars. Maybe you're looking at inventory turnover or inventory sales through, sales per square foot. There are numerous KPIs. And the reason why there are so many is because retail is not an exact science, number one. And number two, each KPI reveals something a little bit different about how well we've done our job in getting to delivering the right product at the right price in the right place at the right time with the right message to the customer, right? So we, in order to understand how well we do in this complex environment that is retail, we study a few of these performance indicators. But we know that running an inventory-based business is expensive. And we know that we can't rest solely on what our customers have done in the past. So we need a mixture of both internal information and external information so that we can really inform what we think our customer is going to do in the future and how we're going to go about really optimizing what we think is going to happen, right? There's, in the absence of certainty and without a crystal ball, we're making a forecast. And the more information, the better informed that forecast can be, the more we're able to mitigate the risk. This is why retailers use data. So specifically, the two types of data we're going to talk about are big and small. So big data is called big data because it is so much information that the human mind can't compute it. It's so large and is so multifaceted. And we're not going to get into technical information about big and small data because that's not super relevant. But I want to just give you broad strokes and give you a general understanding of how you can utilize some of this information. So big data refers to information that a company can attain internally. For example, by collecting information from point of sales or collecting information from online sales. It's also information that you can access externally through companies whose sole purpose is to, as part of their service, to open up the doors to their big data. So my favorite definition of big data comes from Forbes. They published an article way back in 2013 titled, "What is Big Data?" by Lisa Arthur. And she writes that big data is a collection of data from traditional and digital sources inside and outside your company that represents a source of ongoing discovery and analysis. So I like to think of traditional data as data that is point of sales data. Digital data could be online sales, but it could also be social engagement. And the reason why it represents ongoing discovery and analysis is because there is a wealth of information and there are many things you can gather from it. So I like to think of big data as a huge sea of, of life. And you can go into that sea and you can look at a couple of different things and study different things, but you can't really take it all in. It's focused. The reason why we use big data is to really understand the relationship of things. So if a customer buys X, do they also buy Y? If the customer does A, how likely are they to do B? So that's really big data, is understanding relationships. When you think through this whole idea of diving into big data, you really want to approach it with a hypothesis or an inquiry in mind. Otherwise, without a hypothesis or an inquiry or any kind of question that you're trying to answer, any type of relationship question, you will get lost in the data and have analysis paralysis. So on the other end of the spectrum of data is small data. And it's called small data because it's sized in a way that you can actually understand the information without a computer. And the way that I like to relate the two is if big data is every information about all of your customers and what they've bought in your store for the last year, small data is a subset of that. So it might be a subset of how many of my customers bought jeans, right? You can extract that because you're wanting to know number of transactions or number of customers. You have an item description and you have it's time bound, right? So in the last year, how many customers bought jeans? So you're just diving into the data and pulling out what you want, and then you can start to extrapolate some information or some correlation. The second question might be, of the jeans they bought, what designers were most popular? Of the jeans they bought, what size was most popular? Of the jeans they bought, what wash was most popular? And so you'll see that big data is super useful if you are coming up with relationships. So asking those specific questions is the small data version of big data. So there's this fantastic book that was published last year around small data called Small Data, Tiny Clues That Uncover Huge Trends by Martin Lindstrom. And he's a huge believer that small data has the potential to identify trends that are larger than can be identified by studying big data. And he really hones in on this notion of the industry swinging the pendulum too far and getting so caught up in the analytics that we are so screen focused and missing the engagement person to person. And we know there's some truth in that. In particular, we know this from a common sense perspective because experiences are vying for our customers' spend. A great example is the explosion of Airbnb. More people buying experiences versus buying products. And as retail becomes more of a big data game, an artificial intelligence game, as the trend in online retail goes to trying to mimic human interaction, Lindstrom believes that we're just missing information before our very eyes. And so he suggests that if you just shut the screen and interact with people, it's far more revealing than it has the potential to be far more revealing than being so mired in just the analytics alone. And so I like to call that the detective hat. And I think there's a lot of value to it. And I think that as merchants, you're uniquely positioned to study that information. It's why merchants are really great pickers and really great buyers, because they are interacting with customers and understanding trends and not solely caught up in the analytics. So I want to illustrate some examples of how retailers will use big data and they will use small data so that you can really get a flavor for how you might be using your own information that you have access to. So a great example is grocery shopping. So many grocery stores have membership cards that either are used to promote rewards or give you coupons. There are benefits to those membership cards. And my husband does most of the weekly staple grocery shopping against that membership card. And I know and he knows that maybe about 70% of that weekly list is the same all the time. There's always milk, always eggs, always a couple kinds of fruits, always a couple kinds of vegetables, always some yogurt. Maybe every other week there's a loaf of bread. You know, there's some real very predictable things on that list, and the grocery store collects that information. I shop every once in a while, and the types of things I buy is really different than the types of things that my husband buys. I tend to buy seasonal goods, so I'll be the one that buys Valentine's seasonal items for my kids or for school. I will tend to buy smaller food items for something that I might be able to have for lunch that day or prepare for a small dinner that night. It's definitely not to last us the whole week. That membership card will also identify the very few things that we'll buy randomly, every maybe 4 months or 6 months. So for example, I asked my husband to buy a specific type of nail polish remover. 2 weeks ago, I asked him to buy a specific type of small bead organizer so I can organize the letters that I use for this sign. And all that information is well and good. And every time we shop against in that grocery store, that company is collecting every little bit of information about everything in our cart that we buy. And not just about everything in that cart about that we buy. There's multiple characteristics for each item. There is information about time, how frequently we've come in, what time of day we come in, our average transaction. So on average, how much do we spend between his weekly and my every once in a while shopping? The average price point in our cart. So, typically, if you took any one item and it represented, are we typically spending $6 an item or $1.50 an item? So it houses a lot of information. And that information is not interesting until we want to know something about, or until the grocery store wants to know something about how we shop. So the grocery store might want to know how often we buy milk, what kind of milk we buy, and what size of milk we buy. And so if they want to know that, because for whatever reason they want to know that, they would dive into this data and ask these questions, and they would find out that we buy a gallon of 2% milk every week. And every other week we'll buy a half gallon of almond milk, and we might switch that almond milk out for soy milk, right? So they'll find those things out. The reason why retailers want to extrapolate all this information and understand what you're doing and how you're buying and what you're buying is so that they can continue to encourage that. If they like it, they want you to keep doing it, and they're going to encourage it. Or because they want you to do something differently. So maybe they might want to know that information so that after my receipt prints, they're printing out a coupon for a new brand of milk. Or if after my receipt prints, they're printing out a coupon to say buy 2 gallons at a time, right? So they either want to encourage the current behavior or encourage a very different behavior. So that's an example of how someone might use big data and small data. If you have a point of sale system, any size retailing that you do, whether you are selling $2.5 million or $3 million in revenue in a year, or you're selling $25,000 of revenue in a year, it collects data for you. And any of those customer-facing reports, those like really easy to see reports, the dashboards, that's a version of small data from the bigger data. So you have access to that internally. And how I help my clients is shaping through what of that information is important, and knowing that what you put in to your point of sale, the quality of what you put in is really going to help indicate the quality of what you get out of that information. Another great example of big data versus small data, particularly around how much information do you need to have? Like, when does 100 people buying this item mean that it's a good item versus, when does 5 people buying this item mean it's a good item, right? That's maybe not the best example to say, let's talk about data that's really statistically significant versus data that's meaningful. So an example is cell phone apps. So I was with my sister over the weekend, and we were talking about an app that she downloaded, and I recommended another app. I think this is really common amongst friends that like apps, is recommending apps. And I wasn't recommending a specific developer. I was recommending a function. And I said, hey, why don't you download a Tabata timer for her HIIT workouts? And we were looking for a split timer that will measure different intervals of time and allow her to stack those intervals in the way that she wanted. So we just looked up Tabata timer free. Was what we were searching. And 2 apps were interesting. One had a really great interface, but it was new. And it had 8 5-star reviews, really meaningful, glowing reviews. Number 1, and number 2, the app looked nice. 5-star average. Then we looked at the other one that didn't have as nice or as aesthetically pleasing an interface, but it had over 14,000 reviews. The average was just a touch over 4 stars. And so that really illustrates the difference between something that's statistically significant, that those over 14,000 reviews represents just a percentage of the number of people that downloaded the app, versus the meaningful reviews that spoke to my sister. And know that as you start to gather information, depending on the size of your business, how many transactions you ring, the number of people that walk through your door, how long you've been in business, some of your data may be more significant than others, but you can still move forward on very meaningful data. And that's what Lindstrom is really suggesting. That's what I suggest to my clients, is find the data that's meaningful, partner it with some math, and then move in a certain direction. So there are so many ways to gather directional data, in addition to looking at your point of sale, in addition to engagement on the floor. You can look at social media. You can look at your competitive analysis that we talked through last week. So just as retailers use multiple key performance indicators, I want you to be using multiple sources of information. Again, internal and external, small and big data. And that together, that mix together shapes directional data. It allows you to move in a direction without feeling like you're doing a lot of guessing, and it allows you to make better informed choices. So I want to give you your assignment for the week, and I'm going to ask you 4 questions, and they're not questions so that you give yourself a grade. That's not what this is about, but it's about understanding how you're currently gathering your information, so that you can maybe continue to do that or change what you're doing. So these are the 4 questions. Question number 1 is, how do you use your point of sale system to understand your customers? So how do you use your point of sale system to understand your customers? Typically, most of my clients, most businesses will look at, I call them the canned reports or the report templates that you get with your point of sale system. So how are you using them? How frequently? How meaningful is that information to you? So just assess that for yourself. Question number 2 is, are you using the full capabilities of your point of sale? If you are, that's amazing. I am super excited for you. Please reach out to your peers and help them, because if you happen to not be using the full capabilities, identify some time on your calendar when you might want to take the tutorials that that company puts out, because they're putting out a lot of information on how to really utilize the system. Identify what do you need to actually include in your inputs so that you get really good outputs. And that'll take time. So if you want to utilize the full capability of the point of sale, like all the money that you pay for it, you get service out of it. If you'd like to really utilize that, make some time in your calendar. I think it's going to be really beneficial. It's going to pay off in return on investment. Question 3, what types of information are you currently getting from your customers on the sales floor? We know that with really genuine engagement, we get gratified experiences, like experiences that are gratifying to us as retailers, but also gratifying to customers. And when we genuinely engage, we can get a lot more information than just a transaction. So what kind of information are we getting from our customers? What are their occasions? What are their styles? Generally, what are they looking for? Where else do they shop? How often do they come? There's so much we can gather by just putting on our very kind investigative hat. And then question 4 is, how are you and your team really bubbling up this information to each other so that you can do something with that information? So how well are you bubbling it up so you can do something with the information? So really these 4 questions represent, they're all reflective of internal data, company data, but they're a mix of analytics, of, point of sales data and that math, and the art of customer engagement. And when you have this balance of analytics and art, and you partner that with competitive analysis. So if you haven't done your competitive analysis, go to part 3 of the series, competitive analysis for indie retailers and buyers. That mix is really going to help you identify a really good direction. And again, when you ask better questions of the information that you have, you get better answers and you are able to make better informed decisions. So what I want you to do is do this assessment. If you haven't, do your competitive analysis from part 3 in the series, and then join me next week and we're going to talk about actioning on and doing something about this directional data. And until then, sign up for Merchant Method Trend Report bonuses. They are weekly news briefs that really give you a great sense of what these trend reports are going to be about before we go live, and they provide bonus information like third-party resources, the research that I use, and then inspiration, because who doesn't need inspiration? Thank you so much for joining me. This is Chris Gio from Merchant Method, and until then, I'll see you next week. Bye!